from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I wish to welcome you to the 7th program in our 8-week series entitled Journey Through Time, the Historical Human Quest for the Good Life. As you know, in our first 6 programs, we interviewed a particular individual, in most cases someone in history, such as Thomas Jefferson. On today's program, and again next week, we have several historical figures. These are local people in North Idaho who, during our symposium, played famous people in history, and we're delighted to have them with us. We have 3 today, and for you who join us again next week, we'll have 3 more historical figures. First of all, I would like to thank Dorinda Moyer, a member of the staff at North Idaho College, for representing today Rosie the Riveter during the World War II days when she was playing the part of a prototype of women who were in the workplace at that time. And Rosie the Riveter, welcome to our program. We're pleased to have you here and look forward to the interview with you and what happened to you and many other women during that time in this country. And next to her is Alan Lamb, who is a member of the faculty in anthropology at North Idaho College, and he is here today to portray Henry David Thoreau, who lived from 1817 to 1862 and was a famous American author or writer. And we welcome you, Mr. Thoreau, and look forward to the interview with your ideas and how that influenced American literature and American life. And next to him is Judy Whatley, who is a businesswoman in North Idaho, and she is here today to portray Abigail Dunaway, who lived from 1835 until 1915. She was well known as a Northwest feminist and traveled throughout the Northwest and also owned a newspaper and was a journalist. And Ms. Dunaway, we are pleased to have you here to talk about your life and your ideas.
Thank you.
And as always, I'm very pleased to have the 2 regular panelists on our program. First of all is Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and Janelle Burke will start the questioning of our historical figures today.
It is such a pleasure to have you here and to be able to talk with you about the events that occurred in your time. Mrs. Dunaway, let's start with you, but I'd like to ask the same question of all 3 panel members. What kinds of impacts would you like to be remembered? What kinds of things did you do in your time that you would like to be remembered for?
Well, I think I would like to be remembered for the work that I did to secure equal rights for women in the states of Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. You know, for 25 years, I traveled the length and breadth of those states by stagecoach, riverboat, horseback, any means of conveyance I could, speaking for women's suffrage and also for the injustices that women had to suffer in the law. And also I was selling subscriptions to my newspaper, the New Northwest, which I used as a forum for women's issues. It was more than just women's suffrage or the right to vote that I was working for. In the law, we were legal non-entities. We did not exist. We had no rights, no power, and no voice. And I was trying to secure those same rights for women that men had enjoyed for many years. And I was successful in all 3 states.
Mr. Thoreau, how about you?
Well, there are several things I'd like to be remembered for. First and foremost, I think I'd like to be remembered for my work on nature and looking at nature and how we view ourselves relative to nature. I myself enjoy being out in nature quite a bit, and obviously I understand that in your time my book Walden is a very popular book, although my intent when I went to Walden was actually not to write that particular book. A lot of very good things came out of that particular book. I would like to be remembered for contributing to what you call in your time an ecological attitude and the recognition that we are all part of nature, and nature does not revolve around us but is intertwined with our lives.
I take it that was a part of your religion as well.
Yes, it was. I was a transcendentalist, and along with Ralph Waldo Emerson and other notable people. And in my particular religious beliefs, God is immanent in nature and in humans. It's a part of all of us, and we are a part of it as well. This particular belief did not go over too well at my time. In fact, it cost me a possible marriage to one Ellen Sewall. When her parents found out that I was a transcendentalist, they disagreed with the marriage to their daughter. And the same with my brother, John Thoreau Jr., was a transcendentalist as well. He'd asked the same woman to marry him, and again, the declination came from the family, not from her herself. Second thing I'd like to be remembered for is my work on social criticism. I'm really not overly fond of big government, or what you would call bureaucracy, I guess, in today's time. And I am a very heavy social critic. I advocate nonviolent resistance to things that people consider unjust. And I understand that I have influenced people in your time or close to your time, such as Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, etc.
And Rosie, you have had, too, a very big impact on modern times.
Yes, indeed I have. And yet the thing that I would like to be remembered most would be my efforts during the war. I went to work so that some of the boys could go overseas, and that was my main purpose for going into the workforce. I had to leave my 2 children at home. I had to do my shopping. I worried about my husband, something terrible, while he was overseas, so I had the emotional strain, and yet I could not face and look in the eye those boys when they came home if I could not say, I did my part while you were overseas, and I put in my 48-hour week, and I'm real proud. I get $56 a week now, and that's a lot better than the $26 a week that we were paid before the war. But money aside, that's not the issue. The issue is, as long as I'm working, someone else is allowed to go overseas and fight for our homeland.
And what do you want to do when the war is over?
Well, there's a lot of the girls at work, and they're real happy at working, and they'll probably stay in the workforce. But myself, I'll go home. I have 2 children still to raise, and that's my primary concern. And yet I'm real pleased now that they'll hire women, because when the war first came about in 41, there were no women in the factories. And first day that I remember it well, when I first went into the factory and the wolf whistles that we gals got walking across the floor, I was scared. My hands were shaking. And that's not the case anymore. They're real proud of us now in the factory, and they're glad to have us working beside them. So I think women in the future will have a real good open door to getting out there and being able to work if they want to.
Steve Sheen.
Mrs. Dunaway, I'll start with you if I may. Tell us a little bit about how your efforts on behalf of women's rights were received by men and by women.
Well, actually, I had as many problems with the women as I did the men, although I tend to feel that the men influence the women in their decisions. Any change does not come easy, and men were afraid of what would happen if women were allowed to vote. In fact, I was held up to ridicule and as an example of what women would become if we did secure the right to vote. And I never used the word give, because we were not given anything. We worked very hard to secure those rights. But I would go into towns, and oftentimes the churches would close their doors to me, so I would hold meetings in the backs of saloons. And because of this, every week I was denounced from some pulpit as a woman with loose morals because of my visits to saloons. I was pelted with eggs in some towns. But I always had supporters. In every town there were some women supporters, and there were men who did believe in equal rights for women and knew that the time had come that we be allowed to secure the vote. Some of the more populous areas like Portland received us well. The rural areas, Walla Walla especially, we had some very bad incidents in Walla Walla. But it was trying to convince the men that we did an equal share of the labor and that we deserved an equal voice in the government.
I have to follow up quickly before I move on to the other two guests with one question. Were bar owners particularly supportive of the movement, or was allowing you to speak in the back rooms of their establishments, was that mainly an economic decision?
I think it was mainly an economic decision because at one time the women's suffrage movement did link prohibition, although not where I worked. I predicted, and I was right, that linkage would cost us the vote for many years. But they did associate women's suffrage with prohibition, which would put them out of business. So it was purely an economic decision.
Mr. Thoreau, you touched a little bit on your famous doctrine of civil disobedience. I wonder if you'd expand on that just a little bit for us.
Well, the doctrine itself actually came from an act that I engaged in about a year after I started living at Walden, and this would be late July 1846. I went into town because I had a hole in a shoe and I needed to get it fixed. And when I was living out in Walden, I actually was not being a hermit or a recluse or anything like that. Actually, I would have friends visit. I would visit friends. And on occasion, I would go back into town. Well, I went into town, and after I got done at the cobbler's, Sam Staples, the constable, met me outside, and he said that I needed to pay my poll tax. And, well, the problem was that I actually hadn't paid my poll tax for several years in a row, and so I was kind of in the rears, and he insisted that I needed to pay it at this time, and I did not have the money, and if I did, I would not have paid it to begin with because I disagreed with what the money was going to be used for. Well, he said that he would pay it for me, and I said, no, you cannot pay my tax for me, but I do refuse to pay my tax, and so subsequently he threw me into jail, and I spent the night in jail. I was kind of really upset in the morning, and because my Aunt Maria actually had paid my poll tax later on that evening, and it was not her right to pay my tax. Only I can pay my tax. But the tax was on the war with Mexico, and it was also on enforcing slavery laws, and I was very much so at that time, and still am, against the concept of slavery. And I did not like the use of the money by the government for those purposes. And so I was protesting that, and I was protesting it in a very nonviolent fashion. And I always said, and I gladly adhere to this motto today, government is best which governs least, because I do believe people can live deliberately and live very simple lives and live good, fulfilling lives.
And your feeling is that citizens in a democracy have the obligation to take a stand against laws that they feel are unjust? Yes.
And if just people would stand against those, and if they are treated harshly, then they do need to, stand up and let their voice be heard, even if it does mean going to jail. I wrote on civil disobedience a few years after that experience. In 1849 is when I wrote that. I'm very surprised at the response, apparently in your time, that it has gotten. But I'm very pleased as well, because I've understood that people such as Gandhi, who apparently is a very famous person in your time, Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, Supreme Court Justice Douglas, and others have used my work.
Gandhi was a very famous person in Tony's time, but I'm too young to really remember him well. Rosie, a question for you. Would you take just a few minutes and tell us a little bit more? A lot of people don't remember the conditions that existed in this country during the war. Not just in the factories where you helped, but affecting the ordinary lives of citizens. Could you tell us a little about that?
It was a real different time. None of us had realized, of course, we'd lived through the Depression somewhat, so we knew what it was to sacrifice, but it was a totally different time in that we sacrificed because we wanted to. We wanted to support the boys. We would save our grease from our meals and would turn those in so that the folks could make ammunition, the bombs, whatnot. We would sacrifice anything that was necessary. Our children wouldn't ride their bicycles because if they did, that would take away the rubber. We need rubber to send overseas for the boys. And, well, as an example, in fact, Easter was just passed a few weeks ago, and we had Spam for our Easter dinner. It's the first time I've ever had Spam for Easter dinner. But you know what? I knew that my Johnny was having steak overseas. And that's what's important, is that our boy's overseas. And I don't mind sacrificing things like that. And I got some of the best recipes out of my McCall magazine here on how to use just a little bit of shortening, not too much, so that we can send the excess of that overseas. Haven't seen any potatoes in quite a while, but rice works real well, and we still have macaroni and cheese.
Thank you.
All of you have something very much in common, and next week when we do our program, we have other historical visitors, and they will have what you've had. You're set aside from other people in the sense that you have affected history in the course of history, and I want to take advantage of that particular factor in my question. Rosie the Riveter, I will start with you. As you indicated in responding to an earlier question, the fact that the war sent so many men overseas and women replaced them in the factories, which was a support system, was essential to winning the war, and also for economic stability at home. You did that. You proved how very crucial that was. I've heard you say in a previous appearance that when your husband returns home and others, they're going to find you different, that they're not going to come back and pick up where they left off. And would you share with us why it is different and how it is different?
Yes, I've gained some independence now. And I can't go back to the way things were before. It just wouldn't happen. I plan on going back probably to join my kids and raise my family, but as soon as they're raised, I'll probably return back to the workforce. They're more accepting of us now, and I fear if we don't get out into the workforce right away, that maybe they'll forget how talented we are. Why, some of my friends, Betty Lou, she flies an airplane now. Nobody would have let Betty Lou fly that airplane before. She could teach if she would like, but that was about the only thing. The secretaries, they were all men. Nobody would let us girls come. Why, we know how to type just as well as anybody else. And we've got a certain amount of pride now. And I think we've helped men recognize that we can keep our families at home running while we also work in the workforce. We can do both. Not too many men could do that either, I might add. But we're different.
Ms. Thoreau, I will do a similar question to you. You're a maverick. You're independent. You challenge the system as it is. You have written a lot. You have spoken on this subject. So my direct question would be, what are you trying to accomplish? How are you trying to get people to change? And then the second part of the question is that I've always been intrigued with interviewing many people for a long time. What sets some people aside to be really remarkable in their determination and their accomplishments?
Well, this is a question that goes to the heart of who I am and what I believe about myself and people. One of the things that I see in terms of people is that people tend to acquire luxuries and a whole bunch of possessions that they do not necessarily need to enjoy and to live a good quality life. And one of the goals that I would see that I would have is to convince people to let go of some of the things that they've been convinced that they need in life and to simplify. In fact, I would say my model is to simplify, simplify, simplify your life. And to understand that you're part of something greater, not separate yourself from this greater whole. And if I can get people to understand that fact, I believe they can truly enjoy life more. Myself, when I set out to go to Walden, I set out to live my life deliberately, to front the essential facts of life and to see what it had to teach so that I may not die without knowing that I never lived. And in terms of what people do in life in general, I think they get caught up too much in trying to acquire things and trying to be part of a system or a whole, and think of these things as falsely what's necessary and lose track of what it is to really truly live. And I'd like to see people try to truly live. If somebody who goes fishing really discovers that they're not there to catch fish, that there's some other reason they went, and they discover that reason, I feel that they would consider that they have lived.
Ms. Dunaway, you too have that crusading passion, and I would like for you to explain, you've already done that to some extent, but explain what is the driving force behind you, the energy, the passion that you have, and how you feel about really challenging the system as it was in your time.
Well, the driving force had to be the married women that I ran across in my millinery shop that would tell me the stories of injustices and mistreatment that they received from their husbands. I was very blessed. I have a very good husband. But these women would share these stories with me, and they just angered me. And actually, it was my Ben who told me one day that things would never change for women until we had the right to vote. And that just consumed me, those words, that we needed to have the right to vote. So that's where my passion came from, when I would see so many women mistreated. When I remember one time my Ben co-signed notes for a friend and used our farm as collateral. Well, the friend didn't pay the notes, and we lost our farm. And when the sheriff came up to bring me the summons, I remember thinking, now, when that note was signed, I was a silent partner. I had no voice in that. But when penalty came due, I was my husband's legal representative. And I, too, had to share in the misfortune. And this was repeated over and over again. I saw husbands that would take egg money from women and children, women who worked so hard churning butter, doing the night to just have a little bit of money, and their husbands would take it. Husbands who would leave and just desert their families. And then when the women were able to secure some financial means to support their children, the men would return and take it away from them. So seeing those injustices, realizing that I was a legal non-entity, that's a very powerful force. When you realize that not only can you not vote to pick out the people that are making the laws, but that you have no voice in the government, and you really have no voice in your own life. So as you can see, I get very passionate about these things. But it was those things that drove me and just consumed my life. And I still have much work to do. The United States government still has not given us the right to vote. There is much left to be done.
That's one. Excuse me. That's one follow-up question. You've given so much of your life and your energy, and this might be a lesson in our time, where you're visiting with us today, that as you crusade for ideas and all, they're not all accomplished. How do you handle that, even as you come close to the end of life and death, and it has not been all accomplished? What is your reaction?
Well, I feel that I have to pass the torch to younger women. It's difficult for me to get around now. I'm old. But we've got to encourage these young women to get out there. We still cannot do many things. We cannot work. There's much work left to be done. How do we inspire the young women to get out there and do it? I think is to tell them about history, make them see, make them a part of things that are happening.
Janelle Berg.
I want to follow up just briefly on Tony's question and say that you are very involved in some legislation, I understand. Can you explain those two critical pieces of legislation?
Well, I was living in Oregon at the time, and I attended every session of the Oregon legislature, and I lobbied them, petitioned them, and even spoke from the floor sometime, and finally got the sole trader bill passed, which allowed women for the first time to conduct business legally, even in the absence of their husbands. Now that was a real victory. And then a few years later, I take pride in securing the passage of the Married Woman's Property Act, which allowed us to own property. We could have property in our own name. We could keep our wages. We could keep our egg and butter money. And we could even will or sell our property. At that time, we didn't have the right to vote, and I was still working on that, but those were sweet victories.
Now, I know that our time is going to be short, so I want to ask a question about communication. How did you communicate in your time? And we'll start with Mrs. Dunaway.
Well, I have a newspaper, of course, and even doing my travels all over the the states that I traveled through, I would send columns back to the newspaper.
Can I interrupt? Say, would you tell them what your newspaper was, the name of it?
The New Northwest. And I used that as a forum, of course, for women's issues and also for human rights issues.
But you were also a soapbox person,
Oh,
too,
yes,
weren't
I
you?
was quite a lecturer. I am quite a lecturer. In fact, if you have a town hall available this evening, I would be free and happy to lecture there.
And how did you communicate your ideas, Mr. Thoreau?
I communicated my ideas in several fashions. I, too, did the lecture circuit. I taught school more than a couple times, and I also have done a lot of writing and have published some of my works, but primarily through the lecture circuit. In fact, before I wrote Walden, which indeed was not a book that I actually started out to write, it actually came as a response to people asking me why I was living at Walden Pond for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. And when I wrote it, it went through 7 revisions due to feedback that I got off the lecture circuit. And I also helped Ralph Waldo Emerson in a transcendentalist magazine called The Dial, and that was another way that we got what we believed in put to the public.
Now, Rosie, in your time, there were some new forms of communication. The radio was important, and magazines. Can you share with us posters, all
Yes.
kinds of things?
President Roosevelt, in fact, was one who came on the radio and said that we needed to double the number of women in the workforce. That was one of our main messages that were coming across the newsreels at the movies. We'd go to the movies, and every time we'd go, Secretary of War Stimson would come on one of the newsreels, and he would advise us once again that we needed to get out into the workforce. Of course, all of us ladies loved our McCall magazine, and I still read it faithfully every month. There again, it tells us, though, how important it is for us to go out into the workforce and communicating. I still write my family back in Texas as often as I can. We'd always lived near our family before, and once Johnny got sent to the South Pacific, well, I moved out to the West Coast also to be closer to him when he comes home.
I'm going to have to interrupt on that note. I'm so sorry, Rosie the
Okay.
Riveter, to do that. But on behalf of our panel and our staff, we thank all 3 of you, Abigail Dunaway, Henry David Thoreau, and Rosie the Riveter. It's been most enjoyable. Ladies and gentlemen, we will conclude this 8-week series next week with program number 8 on Journey Through Time, the historical human quest for the good life. And we'll be having 3 more historical figures at that time. And we so hope that you've enjoyed this series as much as we have been enjoying bringing it to you. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.